Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you've had a wonderful week. As you remember, a few days ago, over the last couple of days, we had some technical difficulties, only to find out that, thank goodness, it's not the stream that was causing the problems, the streaming service, EVMux. It was instead Twitter changed or X, Morning Infinite, changed its policy and mechanics of how it manages a live stream, and that's why it wasn't showing up on my feed ever, and I was like totally confused. So good to know at least that it's on the receiving side of the broadcast, so to speak. Knowing that, if you don't see it posted, which I will do, you have to click on the icon when you're on the person's profile page. So when you're on Jonah Stormrider, you can click on the icon, and then it'll pull up the live. I'll typically, now that I know this, I will do that myself and then repost as I have this morning. So it should be much easier to find. So again, thank you for your patience over the last couple of days. Now, today we're going to talk about the chapter, as you've seen from the title of this broadcast here, that there's no composition in God. Okay. I want to take a step back for a second before we start reading, and just as a mind refresh of where we've come from, right? So initially we talked about the pursuit of wisdom. What is wisdom? How should it be? How should we go about pursuing it? And then we just said, okay, well, whatever wisdom is, and whatever the order of this science needs to be, it needs to start with this first highest being, whatever that is, we're going to call God. And so since then, well, first we had to establish that this thing existed, that there was a first highest being. Once establishing that, again, all from reason, we looked at the idea of remotion and how we can talk about God by removing, or how we can think about God by removing imperfections. So earlier this week, we said, well, God is eternal, but what we understand that is he's outside of time. He's not bound by time. Remember, we're saying what God is not. We're saying that there's no passive potency, which is a sophisticated philosophical way of essentially saying that there's no ability to change in God, that he has to be unmoving. If he's going to be the prime unmoved mover, there has to be no potency at all, no ability to change. Then we said, okay, well, not only that, but there's no matter in God. And then now we're going to talk about there's no composition in God. And then from here, there's going to be probably about 4 or 5 other none of this, none of that's in God. So we're just kind of basically trying to come to purify the image we have in our mind of what this first unmoved mover, this highest being is. Then it gets interesting. Well, I mean, it's been interesting, but he goes from there to, okay, well, let's talk about how we name God. Well, first he talks about like what he is in his essence, and goes a little bit deeper there over the next several days. But then he's going to be like, okay, well, now let's talk about how we name God and how we talk about God. Because we don't want to just limit ourselves to saying what God is not. We want to actually ask the question about whether or not we can say anything positive about God, actually affirm any attributes or qualities positively, not just remotion, that is removing imperfections, saying he's not this and not that. Can we even say anything about this highest order of being? We'll find out. Well, the book would end there if the answer was no, right? So clearly we know the answer is going to be yes, but how do we arrive there? All right, so without further ado, and then I have a little surprise for you guys as well, because this is, again, another little short chapter. I have a little surprise for you guys after this. So make sure you have your warm cup of Jonah. And then also, please do make sure to share the stream if you enjoy this, But also, don't forget to check out all the other podcasts on phoneboothpodcast.substack.com. All right, without further ado. That there is no composition in God, chapter 18. From what we have set down, we can conclude that there is no composition in God. In every composite, there must be act and potency. For several things cannot become absolutely one, unless among them something is in act and something in potency. Now, being and act are not united except by being, so to speak, bound or joined together, which means that they are not absolutely one. Their parts, likewise, are brought together as being in potency with respect to the union, since they are united in act after being potentially unitable. But in God there is no potency, therefore there is no composition in him. A good example of this is our soul is called the form of our body. Our body, being matter, this is me, not him, by the way. Just so you're not confused. Matter is passive. It's pure potency. Prime matter is pure potency. So when our form, our soul, takes our body as its and gives it, and when they're united, philosophically, excuse me, we would say that the matter is potency, and the form is active, and it's what gives the passive matter its being, right? I think Aristotle lays that all out in De Anima, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. Every composite, moreover, is subsequent to its components. The first being, therefore, which is God, has no components. Every composite, furthermore, is potentially dissoluble. This arises from the nature of composition, although in some composites there is another element that resists dissolution. Now, what is dissoluble can not be. This does not befit God, since he is through himself the necessary being. There is therefore no composition in God. And we see this. This is our experience. We haven't maybe thought about it in these terms before, but just taking the example I just gave, form and matter of our body. When our soul leaves our body, when we pass away, and we call that death. There's a ceasing to be there, right? Every composition, likewise, needs some composer. For if there is composition, it is made up of a plurality, and a plurality cannot be fitted into a unity except by some composer. If then God were composite, he would have a composer. He could not compose himself, since nothing is its own cause, because it would be prior to itself, which is impossible. Now the composer is the efficient cause of the composite. Thus God would have an efficient cause. Thus, too, he would not be the first cause. Which was proved above. Again, in every genus, the simpler a being, the more noble it is. For example, in the genus of the hot, fire, which has no admixture of cold. That, therefore, which is at the peak of nobility among all things, must be at the peak of simplicity. But the being that is at the peak of nobility among all beings we call God, since he is the first cause. For a cause is nobler than an effect. God can therefore have no composition. A fun example of this in Aristotle's writings, of this idea that there's the simplicity, the higher genus has more simplicity. If you look at like spiders or some of these insects, right? They produce tens of thousands of offspring, right? Because most of them are not going to make it. So in order to preserve the species, it has to have so many. How many children do most people have? Very few. Depending on various things. But most families today have 2 or 3 kids. Fine, okay, that's enough. Historically, especially when medicine was less sophisticated and lifespans were less, people would have 5, 6, 7, 8 kids. But anyhow, so you can see that like the more noble, even in the animal kingdom, the more noble animals tend to have fewer offspring because they're more survivable and they're more sophisticated and excellent. But so this idea is that you go up the hierarchy of beings, and at the top you have the most simple. So the more noble is more simple. I really like this. I really like that concept. Furthermore, in every composite, the good belongs, not to this or that part, but to the whole. But I say good according to the goodness that is proper to the whole, or its perfection. For parts are imperfect in comparison with the whole, as the parts of man are not a man. The parts in the number 6 do not have the perfection of 6. And similarly, the parts of a line do not reach the perfection of the measure found in the whole line. If then God is composite, his proper perfection and goodness is found in the whole, not in any part of the whole. Thus there will not be in God purely that good which is proper to him. God, then, is not the first and highest good, if that were true, right? Again, prior to all multitude, we must find unity. But there is multitude in every composite. Therefore, that which is before all things, namely God, must be free of all composition. I think it's poetically beautiful that the argument for this particular argument is so simple. I think it's lovely because it's just kind of again underlining in a different way that this idea of composition, like form and matter, like body and soul, even he just uses the number, the more tangible examples, so to speak, or simple examples of numbers are a group of things, a combination, a unity of things in some way. So I love this idea that the more noble thing is more simple. And being more simple, it's composite. Note as well, he said the composite can cease to be, because if something brought it together and made it one thing, it can, hey Foray, good to see you. It can then be that composition, that unity between its parts can be dissolved or can be removed, as in the case of death for us, correct? So it's interesting. It's beautiful, this reflection on the simplicity of God. Okay, so the surprise that I mentioned, I've referenced a number of times this work. It's relevant now, but it's going to be more relevant later as well. But I wanted to read you the first couple paragraphs of that favorite work of mine of Thomas on being in essence, because it's so beautiful. And keep in mind, this wonderful teacher, Thomas, when he was just 21, he resolved one of the oldest, at the time, one of the oldest philosophical disputes and arguments between the East and the West, especially, on the meaning of the terms being in essence. So it's called De Ente et Essentia, regarding being and essence. But it has such a beautiful, the introduction where he justifies his approach to the question and the order of these 14 short pages. He justifies the order in just a couple of paragraphs, or a couple sentences, really. But I thought you would appreciate just the reading of it because of what he says here. So I'm going to go ahead and read this little snippet to you because I think you'll enjoy it. Okay. So he says, a small mistake in the beginning is a big one in the end, according to the philosopher in the first book on the heavens and the earth. And as Ibn Sina says in the beginning of his Metaphysics, being and essence are what is first conceived by the intellect. Thus, to avoid making mistakes out of ignorance of them, and to become familiar with the difficulties they entail, we must point out what is signified by the words being and essence. So we're going to define terms, and how they are found in diverse things, and how they are related to the logical intentions, genus, species, and difference. Since we ought to acquire knowledge, he continues, of what is simple from what is composed, and come to what is prior from what is posterior, so that beginning with what is easier, we may progress more suitably in learning, we ought to proceed from the meaning of the word being to that of the word essence. Part of the reason I chose to read this little snippet, that's it. Part of the reason I chose to read this little snippet to you today is because he mentions in there, since we ought to acquire knowledge of what is simple from what is composite. So it's fitting because today we're talking about whether or not there's composition in God. And again, by way of remotion, as we know we're kind of, that's the theme of all the different chapters today. Shiva says, be careful, bro. People in 2026 get triggered when we define words and they don't like definition. That's true. What is a woman after all? That's hilarious, Shiva. Thank you, Foray, for reposting. But yes, okay, so how interesting is it that so today we're saying, okay, well, God is not composite. So we're not even we're not yet saying anything positive, affirming anything or claiming anything about God affirmatively. Again, this is that remotion. We're removing things. So we have this challenge because the way of knowledge, as it says here, since we ought to acquire knowledge of what is simple from what is composed, and come to what is prior from what is posterior, so that beginning with what is easier, we may progress more suitably in learning. So the way that we learn something and progress in our knowledge and understanding of something is by moving from the composite to the simple, from the posterior, or from that which comes after, is another way of saying it, right? The posterior to the prior. So it's beautiful because that's also what we're doing in this book here. We're looking at what we understand is some things bound by time. So God is not bound by time. So we're moving away from that. Today we talked about composition to simplicity. And so we're using this exact same structure of the considerations that he outlines in that book, Dan, on being in essence. Meyer, I'm affirming my breakfast sandwich. Cheers to that. So there you have it. It's kind of a beautiful summary and of the method that he uses here. And he has another work I might surprise you with surprise you with another reading from something else that Thomas wrote on. He wrote a letter to a student that's wonderful about the process of learning. So I'll see if I can dig that up. Dead game. Time is a man-made construct. No comment required. Okay, yes and no. So let's. It depends on how we define time. Dead game, because the measuring conventions and the terms that we use to all be on the same page about time and to enumerate it, so to speak, I agree with you 100%. It's a man-made construct. Is it a man-made construct that there is a passage of time? Now, obviously, we know, or we've understood from our considerations earlier in this book as well, that God is outside of time. This creator, this prime mover, is outside of time. So in that sense, it's a human experience for sure. But did we create this time? What is time? Well, Aristotle says time is a measurement of movement. So if things are moving, then there's a before and after, whether that movement is locomotion or growth. So in one sense, time is a human experience that we're trying to describe by the man-made construct of the convention of describing, it's 8:30 a.m., right? That is a man-made construct. But our experience of before and after of movement, before a child ever learns how to tell time or has learned that man-made construct element of it, then they still experience a before and after. They still experience the phenomena of the passage of time, but they don't know they haven't learned the human convention of naming it and describing it so that we can all be on the same page. So I agree with you with a caveat. I also agree from the sense a bit more I guess we could say abstractly or philosophically, I would agree with that statement as well, just from the standpoint that it's something proper to man and physical realities. Excuse me. In other words, if there were no material beings outside of the eternal unmoved mover, then there wouldn't be time, because he's not there. If there's nothing bound by movement or physicality, then there would be no time because there's nothing to measure. Linear for man, but just in the present. Correct. In the sense that, yes, when we imagine before and after, that's in our minds, right? Like if I picture the future and imagine the future or remember the past, those things don't exist currently in this moment other than in my mind. So yes, in that sense as well. Meyer says time is exactly as it says. It's just a passage, which means it's a key. It's just a key or a walkway through what we call time or view as time. It's just another hallway or a sidewalk. It just leads us to places, and we call it time. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. Smells like victory, says Meyer. So, yeah, again, this concept that you're right. Only the present moment truly exists. Absolutely. Absolutely. Past and future exist in our minds as memory or imagination. But yes, so I agree with that as well. But if you think about it, again, we want to be careful, because when we imagine, sometimes, Aristotle, you weren't even allowed, especially as men, because men have a very vivid spatial imagination, right? We have, chemically, we have a much stronger imaginative power. Just by the way our physiology is set up, it's more conducive to that. So oftentimes, like for example, the male mind has a easier time at imagining the invisible side of an object, right? Or rotating an object in your imagination. Men typically have a stronger imaginative power, right? So we can kind of imagine the other side of the vehicle that we're looking at. We can see it in our mind's eye or whatever, right? So because of this strong faculty of imagination, back in the days of Aristotle, men weren't even considered an apprentice to a philosopher until they were 40 years old, at least. You couldn't even start to study philosophy until that point, because one of the main sources of error, especially amongst men, is to rely too heavily on the imagination and then make errors in the intellectual thought and the reasoning because we're relying on the imagination. So it's interesting. So although it can be useful to consider time like a hallway or a sidewalk, it can be useful, and that analogy can help us. Like potency is to act as motion is to rest, or reasoning is to a conclusion as motion is to rest. That's an analogy that is that's a beautiful and powerful imaginary image that helps us understand a little bit more deeply that the relationship between reasoning and conclusions, right? So there's a lot of value in that, but we have to be careful that we don't make mistakes in our reasoning because we're relying too heavily on the imagination. Does that make sense? So we do have to be attentive, because when we're talking about time, for example, if time is a measurement of movement, we can imagine, well, if I had gone left instead of right, what would the outcome have been? So maybe there's a world when there's another timeline that exists that right? So like maybe we can imagine multi-universes that they have now, and that doesn't mean that those things exist. Just because we can imagine that it could be this way, or we imagine that everything is a simulation and we're in the Matrix and this is all an illusion, doesn't mean it is so, just because we can imagine it. So, yes, that's about the time a man's head is settled enough to do so. Exactly. 40 is a starting point in a man's head. I personally, I've always been, this is surprising no one here, kind of a nerd, right? I love to ponder things, to deep dive into things, to analyze things. I do so with more clarity. I can feel the clarity increasing as I get older. So I'm 41 now, and I can feel in my mind, I perceive and sense this shift. So it's really interesting. The Vedas describe time as infinitely spherical. So interesting. What does that mean? And is that a reliance on imagination? What does it mean to be infinitely spherical? Right? Are we relying too much on our imagination with that claim, with that definition or description? Are there some truths? I'm sure there are some truths to what's meant there. But again, what is time? Time is completely present. All time is present to God right now. We perceive motion and movement as we exist in this moment as it rolls through time. Myself included, dead game. Yep, exactly. So we need to be careful, Shiva, as well, when again, just what are the claims by saying it's infinitely spherical? What's being claimed there? It's a nice image, but again, we want to make sure that we're not relying on our imagination and drawing conclusions that don't necessarily fit or belong, or that could be stated more perfectly, right? So this is an interesting challenge throughout all of these considerations that we have. Sometimes a physical analogy is helpful, but we also have to be careful, right? So, the current present, Dead Game says, is now the past, and you're speaking in the future. Well, not to be cute, but technically, since there's a little bit of a delay on the stream, me speaking is in the past for me when you hear it, and it's in the future for you as I speak it. So, anyways, I don't know. But Shiva says it's all cyclical and a reliance of infinite experience. Is it cyclical? My life seems to be linear. In my experience, my life is linear. I came to be at some point. I've grown in knowledge and understanding. I've moved around this realm, interacted with other things, other people, had experiences in succession. I can time and describe and tell the story of my life and my journey to you guys using the human convention of time and description of years, months, seasons, 40 years, 41 years. What does that mean? That means something definite to you guys because we all have the same convention. Maybe we don't need to be as careful as you think we do, Jonah. God does will everything after all. It's true that God wills everything. I agree 100%. But if we're going to speak precisely, and as we get to more and more subtle analyses of what's going on, how this world is structured, how being is ordered, how this unmoved mover interacts with creation, how creation came to be, different things that we can know about this cause by the effects that are in the things that have been created, we do have to be careful. The reason we have to be careful is because these are difficult things for us to discern and to figure out. Because this being transcends so much, we can't just look at a stone and be like, okay, well, this must have been from this part of the world, or these conditions it must have undergone, or it's composed of these minerals, etc. That's easy, you know. But when we start to get to the higher, more subtle truths, we have to be careful. Why? A small mistake in the beginning, going back to De Ante Essentia, on being in essence by Thomas, a small mistake in the beginning is a big one in the end. So we have to be careful because we don't want to fall into error, because a small error because what we're doing is science. This philosophy, these philosophical reflections is science, because we want to be able to rest confidently and firmly on the knowledge that we acquire as we parse out meanings and be very precise to avoid error when we're speaking of this first unmoved mover, so that we can get to know more about all of reality and understand it more profoundly. Shiva, I would love that. I would love for us to get together and talk in longer form content about it, which is a great segue. Remember, folks, to check out Philosopher King podcast. We had a great episode on Wednesday evening, a couple days ago here. We talked about fasting and the benefits physically to fasting, to our health, the benefits of the discipline, the spiritual benefits as well in some way. It was a really wonderful conversation. So I encourage you to check that out. It's on the Substack as well. But yes, Shiva, let's DM me. Let's get in touch, because that would be a fun conversation. I'm sure it would be fun. You know, I'm using that word casually. It would be a very interesting and mutually edifying conversation. I love these philosophical talks, says Dead Game. I really do need a stable daily. Give one something to ponder each day. Thanks, Jonah. And yes, I want to hear that back and forth, Shiva. Perfect. I love it. As I've said before, guys, this has become the highlight of my morning as well. I so much enjoy all of you who come here to kind of wrestle with these ideas and think through these thoughts with me and see where it takes us together. So I love it. So I'm gonna call it there today. Tomorrow, as you know, we're going to continue on this journey of remotion, talking about what imperfections we can be certain are not found in God, and go from there. I will also be inviting all of you on Saturday, a little teaser trailer. Tomorrow we're going live with the guys from Phone Booth Podcast. I personally am going to be starting, and I'm going to invite everybody into an extended fast. So Shiva says, I've been fasting 22 hours a day for 8 years. It's wonderful. It's so good for your health, that intermittent fasting. As I'm sure you're aware, it's called intermittent fasting. One of the things we talked about on last Wednesday was, if you're going to do an extended fast, what are the benefits? We talked about how on day 3, human growth hormone spikes and autophagy spikes, and then what happens on day 4 and 5 with your stem cells and how it heals your body. It's really wonderful. It's wonderful. So definitely check it out. We're going to be doing an extended fast, 5 to 7 days at least, starting on Wednesday. That way people have a couple days, because it's good to kind of prepare your body for an extended fast. But water only is one of the most beneficial fasts you can do. But yeah, Infinite, great interaction, says great interaction today. Jonah, thank you. And Dead Game says he's also fasted for 25 to 30 years, but not rigidly. Yeah, it's so funny. I call myself a carnivore adjacent. So because fasting is not just, we can not just talk about timing of food, although that's the primary meaning that we talk about, but also like fasting from certain food groups. So for example, like the carnivore diet or vegan or something like that. I've been carnivore adjacent for many years now. So I say carnivore adjacent. I was for a little while pure carnivore, red meat only, but I like a glass of wine with my meat, so I'll do that. I like an occasional plate of pasta, so I will do that as well. So I'm not like a strict carnivore, but I more often than not will just be eating meat. But anyways, we are far astray from our philosophical convo here, but all good stuff. So I loved the conversation today and the interactions in the chats. So thank you all. Thank you for sharing as well. Appreciate it. Check out the live stream with the guys tomorrow at phoneboothpodcast.substack.com. Also on most of our channels, you can find us. We go live tomorrow at 7 p.m. EST, and there we go. So it's been a wonderful morning with you all. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day. And we will the next Cup of Jonah will be on Monday morning, same time, same channel. God bless you guys. Have a great rest of your day.